Hi, my name's Phil and I like talking about politics. And it's still Brexit on the menu. It's probably going to be Brexit on the menu for a while. I actually keep wanting to talk about other stories, but it just keeps coming. So what I've been doing today is I came across a video of a lecture given by Sir Ivan Rogers. Now, I wouldn't expect you to know who he is. Like most civil servants, even extremely senior ones, not very well known. They're sort of the guys behind the scenes. He's no longer a civil servant. He has resigned from the civil service in the wake of the Brexit fiasco. But he was basically Mr. EU for us. He was the permanent representative to the EU, basically our ambassador in the EU. He knows how it all works there. He knows how the negotiations have gone. Very knowledgeable person. And he gave a lecture to the University of Liverpool. I've put a link to it, the full thing, in the description below. But it was so interesting that I wanted to talk about some of the things he said and my own sort of comments on those as well in this video. But I would recommend that you go and watch that as well, because it's really eye-opening. And just to praise you this, one of the more disturbing things about all the things he was saying is I was thinking to myself, do you know what? We have a situation in this country where we have experts, people who actually know how these things go down, telling us 2 years ago, if we do this, this is going to happen. And they've been proven right. And yet we had the other people, the ones who were going, no, it's going to be fantastic. And they gave lots of predictions as well, which have all been proved wrong. And yet there's still so many people in this country still believing these guys. Obviously, they've changed their stories. Every time they got proved wrong, they just changed their reality. And yet so many people still listen to it. Anyway, so first thing he went through, basically the aim of the lecture was to go through what he considered were lessons that we need to learn in the wake of the fiasco of the past few years, last 2.5 years. The first one was Brexit is Brexit. Now, he didn't mean by that the usual political meaning of that, which is we voted for Brexit, so we're going for Brexit. What he actually was trying to emphasize is we're leaving the EU. This is regime change. You know how you see on the news how we and other countries like the US attack countries in an attempt to force regime change because we don't like who's running it? That's what we're putting ourselves through. Lots of things are tied to the fact that we've been in the EU for so long, our economics, our legal system, our political system, and there is going to be major upheaval as a result of that. After this, there will be no frictionless trade. There can't be. Frictionless trade requires freedom of movement and the European Court. And of course, our position is we don't want either of those things. Now, the trade deal will be a complete nightmare. There's, again, a lot of things that people are not being told. So we now know that we are going to have to negotiate a trade deal after Brexit. Now, we know we can't do it before. We were told by the experts that we can't do it before we leave. They told us that, but we didn't believe them. We believed the guys who said, yes, we totally can. We now know that we can't, so we're going to have to do it after we're outside of the EU. Okay? And people will still have this idea that we'll be able to negotiate a great deal. Will we really? Because remember this, the EU is going to be representing EU members. That will not then include us. At the moment, it bats for us. It's not going to now that we've decided to leave. So what does that mean? That means that when it comes to the Ireland issue, it will take the side of Dublin over London. Of course it will, because Republic of Ireland is a member state of the EU. All right? It's not a broker. The EU is not a facilitator to negotiators. It is the negotiating side. It will now be our opposition and we will be its opposition. Obviously, both sides are going to want a good trade deal. That means you're in a competition. All right. Then there's the issue of Spain. In order to placate Spain, Gibraltar is going to be front and centre. Then there's the issue of fishing. All the fishermen of Britain delighted. It means, we're going to be the only ones who are going to be allowed to fish in our waters. Obviously, Britain, being an island nation, we have a lot of very good fishing waters, which at the moment, other EU member states can fish in. British fishermen don't like this. Okay. But here's the problem. There are member states in the EU that still will want to fish in our waters. Those British fishermen think that we're going to go, no, we're reclaiming sovereignty. Only our ships are going to be able to fish there. Then we don't get a trade deal because the EU will side with those EU member states that want to fish in those waters. And this is the irony of it all. People keep talking about we're going to regain sovereignty as if we've really lost it in the first place. I mean, the point can be made, and I would certainly make, that actually forming such a powerful body as the EU enhances your sovereignty. But anyway, it really doesn't matter. This idea of reclaiming our sovereignty, it's actually going to be the reverse. In order to get a trade deal, we are going to have to give up things. We're actually going to, and publicly as well, there'll be no hiding this. There will be no hiding it. We will have to concede sovereignty in order to get that. And this is the thing. You know, it's not just because we're bad at negotiating. Every country in the world has to in order to trade. If you're going to trade with anyone, because again, people keep coming up with this mad thing, oh, we'll just trade with other countries, which is total madness. We've already gone through that. Sorry if you think that, you're just retarded. I'm sorry. But whatever country you want to trade with, you have to agree a set of rules, right? If you're going to have trade between two nations, you have to negotiate some acceptable rules for doing so that's going to be acceptable to both sides. That means you are conceding sovereignty. Every nation, the most powerful nations on earth do it. We actually concede much less by being in the EU because the EU is the most advanced trading bloc on earth. It has shown this with its negotiating skill. We know that the EU is also hugely influential in other areas as well. I mean, YouTube are going absolutely mad at the moment, you know, because they're worried about EU legislation to do with copyright, and they're bricking it. Now, why would an American, massive American-based company be bricking it? Because of the EU? Because the EU's influence extends well beyond the EU. It is very powerful, very influential. And we want to leave them and be their opposition, their competition. All right, then. Good luck with that. Cross-border data flow, essential to trade. And again, the EU is the leader in data protection in the world. If we decide we don't like those rules, again, it's all about, oh, we're just going to come up with our own laws. If we decide we don't like their rules, that's fine, no problem. We just don't trade. And that's not trading with the EU. Because the EU is so influential, other countries, non-EU countries, also adopt those standards, those rules. We won't be trading with them either. So it's not just that because of the EU, we won't be able to trade with the EU if we don't agree to their rules. We won't be able to trade with an awful lot of other countries because, and not, you know, so trading with other countries, say the US, for example, we don't have to agree to the US's rules for trade. We're still going to have to agree to some of the EU's rules because the US has had to in order to trade with the EU as well. You know, people just don't understand this sort of thing. At the end of the day, we are going to have to trade. That's all there is to it. You know, although we are an island, we're not an island in the metaphorical sense. We cannot exist on our own unless we all go back to being poor pig farmers. And even then, I don't think we really have enough pigs. We have quite a lot of chickens, maybe chicken farmers, digging lots of lovely mud, like in Monty Python's Holy Grail. So we're going to trade with other nations. That means we're going to have to agree to a set of rules. So we're going to concede sovereignty. We're going to concede sovereignty. We're going to basically, to get trade deals, have to give up more than we ever gave up to be in the EU. And I don't think we really gave up anything to be in the EU, other than fecklessness. We were also told, as I've already mentioned here, that we would have a full trade deal with the EU, and indeed other countries around the world, by exit day. We don't. We don't even have close to one. We haven't even started negotiating one with any country in the world. And yet there's a lot of people who still side with the retards who said we would. And we also need to bear this in mind. All the people that said, yeah, it'd be easy, David Davis, Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, all those guys who said, yeah, it's easy, no problem, we'll have a brilliant deal. Not one of them has ever seen a trade treaty in their entire lives. Not one of them even knows what one is. They have zero experience. People, lots of people in this country are listening to guys who have zero experience of international trade negotiations and diplomacy. Why? Why are we listening to those guys? Why are we not listening to the ones who actually have the experience of drawing up trade deals? Why are they not being listened to? Because there's none of those guys saying, yeah, we can totally make a go of Brexit. Not one of them is saying it's going to be better. You know, it's a bit like the Muppets on Kitchen Nightmares. That's what it brings to mind. You know, when Gordon Ramsay goes in and you've got this restaurant being run by someone who's not a trained chef. They've never worked in a restaurant before. They've got no catering experience. But, you know, they had a load of money. They opened up a restaurant and it's failing. Who'd have thunk it? It just brings that to mind. We also, the other thing he pointed out, I think I've mentioned this before, we gave up what negotiating position we had, because it's not like we were onto a loser from the start with this. What negotiating position we had, we threw away when we triggered Article 50. You know, in order for Theresa May felt for whatever reason that she needed to trigger it ASAP in order to show that she was serious about it. The problem was that as soon as she did that, it put us on a timer. And we shouldn't have done it until we were ready, and we were not ready. We didn't even at that point have a negotiating strategy. The Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister at the time, had not even met with the negotiators. There was no strategy laid out, no timetable, nothing when she triggered it. I mean, we don't even have a realistic plan now. We've got this deal, which Parliament really looks like it's not going to vote for, and that's it. There were, apparently, according to Sir Ivan, there were some EU member states who were actually a little bit worried. They were concerned that we were going to use divide and rule strategies in the negotiations and actually end up with a decent deal out of it. Now, I didn't do this channel at the time, but I certainly used to talk to other people I knew. You know, I always had the view that it's desperately important for the EU, because also remember at the time in the EU, there were a lot of, I mean, those parties still exist, but at the time there were quite a few parties in various EU member states, major economies as well, that are also fairly anti-EU, rise into prominence. And it was a serious concern then. They, after, you know, the early stages of Brexit, died down a little bit as other nations saw what a ham-fisted attempt we were making of it. But it was a real concern. So it was absolutely imperative for the survival of the EU that we not be seen to get a good deal out of this. And they were worried we might end up with one. They really thought that we could, you know, drive a very hard bargain and, as I say, play one country off against another. But they failed to take into account that our government's as thick as mince. As soon as Theresa May triggered Article 50, that was it. That went up in smoke. They basically gave us too much credit and have probably been pissing themselves laughing since. Can't believe their luck. How thick are we? The transition period as well. We talk about, you know, as part of this deal that May's negotiated, having a transitional period so that we can then work through all the problems that everyone at the start said we'd be able to work through during the 2 years, which of course never happened. So the transition deal was also not part of the original plan, which is why this deal is not going to be sold, because it wasn't part of the plan to have a deal that looked like this with the transition period, with the backstop. And so, because people didn't appreciate the complexity of it and all the problems, even though they were glaringly obvious. So that's why she can't sell it to Parliament, because it just came out of the blue, because people weren't paying attention. And again, you know, we had basically complete muppets trying to negotiate with what is probably the most effective negotiating group on the planet. The EU is the most sophisticated trading bloc on the planet, and they are used to hard negotiations and winning those hard negotiations. And we tried to go up with them. We tried to go up against them with David Davis. The other problem he identified is that in the original referendum, this is a problem I've identified, people were not asked to give their reasons for voting leave if that was the case. That means that the nature of Brexit could be hijacked. There are a lot of different post-EU arrangements that could exist. You know, the vote was simply to leave the EU. You know, there's a lot of different post-EU, outside of the EU arrangements you can have with the EU and with the wider world. But what we're getting is a more extreme version than anyone campaigned for. Even the ones who are now campaigning for that extreme version, they didn't before the referendum. And people keep saying that anything different to that, anything less extreme than that, is just Brexit by name only. Now, asking whether you want to be in the EU or out of the EU, when out of the EU can represent very different outcomes, is not very helpful in carrying out the will of the people. And of course, any number of people will say that they know what the will of the people is, but they are either lying or stupid, because the people were not asked, and therefore nobody knows. I mean, I would be quite certain that 52% of that poll was not in favour of the extreme Brexit, purely because, first of all, just statistically that would be impossible anyway, because different people would have voted leave for different reasons, just like different people would have voted remain for different reasons. But specifically because no one, not Nigel Farage, Jacob Rees-Mogg, David Davis, Boris Johnson, any of the other leavers, not one of them campaigned for this extreme Brexit. Not one of them. Not one of them even campaigned to leave the single market. The other thing is, a part of these negotiations, we've basically given up on trading services. You know, our services industry is not even part of the negotiations. And the reason for that is, again, in the interest of this so-called sovereignty, because that would mean free movement would need to be a thing and the European courts would need to be involved. So we don't even bother to try and negotiate for that. The problem with that is that we are a service nation. We are a nation where a large part of our economy is the services industry, various different types of services. So we're automatically saying that a large portion of our economy is screwed because we're not even attempting to negotiate access at the moment for services. People arguing that the World Trade Organization would be a great deal for us. Oh, let's just go to the WTO. It would be loads better. But those same people, the reason they said they wanted to leave in the first place was that they were arguing that the WTO arrangements are a terrible thing. We want to be able to negotiate our own individual trade deals with the rest of the world. And that's why we want to leave the EU. That's their argument then. But now apparently WTO would be marvellous. Absolutely magnificent. So, and again, it's this contradiction. And people, I don't know, it's like they're listening to these people who 2 years ago were saying something completely contradictory. And I can only conclude that it's these people who don't pay attention to anything ever and therefore don't retain this knowledge, because it would require delusion on the scale I've never seen before in a person to have forgotten everything that they were saying 2 years ago. So it can only be that they have no attention span. I'm sorry, but that's the only explanation for this. Brexiteers say that they want free trade deals with, nations around the world. But free trade is only possible with legal and political harmony. Of course it is. Because every country has laws on what goods can come into we will, independent of the EU, we will have our own, we'll have the attitude that certain things shouldn't be coming into the country and that certain things potentially, shouldn't even believe in it, but definitely about things coming into the country. Well, so do other countries. Because do you know what? Another thing you were saying is, guess what? Other countries like their sovereignty too. So you can't have a free trade deal where you just chuck them whatever. Just because someone in that country wants to buy it doesn't mean say that country's happy them letting them get hold of it. So, I mean, imagine if a complete free trade deal without any legal harmony or anything like that. Oh, so that's fine. We'll just sell missiles to some random guy who lives in the middle of Japan or something like that. I don't think Japan would be too happy about that. So you've got to have some political and legal harmony to have a free trade deal. And yet the people who say they want a free trade deal, which is what we've got at the moment, are then saying, no, we mustn't have that. We must have all the sovereignty. Again, contradictory. Doesn't make sense. The other thing is the EU, again, obviously it's not great for the EU a no deal, but they will bide their time with it because they know that we are going to pay through the nose for access to their markets, for access to the services. They know this because we need them. We've been set up to need them. People in this country at the moment, a lot of people are just deluded that they can keep their standard of living. When that doesn't happen, they don't realise where a lot of stuff comes from. It doesn't come from within this country. Only so much of it does. And when they realise this, they're going to be baying for blood. And we, therefore, our government will be forced to placate them, to pay through the nose for it. And they also know this because there are other third countries, as they're called, countries that are not EU countries, that also pay through the nose for access to these things without being a member of the EU. So they know we will, and they also know we will because we're going to be more desperate. You know, the other countries, when they agreed their fees, which are astronomical, you've got to remember there's a country the size of Norway, which is a much smaller economy than us, pays almost as much for access to EU markets as we do as a member state, and yet we're a major part of that member state who gets to decide on rules and all the rest of it. The other thing is Sir Ian reckons that these things that the Brexiteers keep denying now because they're not apparent will become apparent in a couple of years. He says, there's not going to be any hiding it for good. My fear, although I say fear, in many ways it would have been a good thing, taking the long-term view, was always that the Brexiteers will always be able to carry on with their nonsense because enough politicians would be responsible enough to make sure that the worst outcomes of Brexit won't actually happen and will do what's necessary to manage it. However, he doesn't seem all that confident that we're behaving responsibly at all, and he's definitely of the view that there will be no hiding it. So basically, guys, all those people who are going to do the usual comments down there, it's getting boring now, but you carry on. I like comments. You come and see me in 2 years' time. Come and see me in 2 years. Might not even be 2 years. Because it's absolute madness. It's like I will listen to experts on things. If I want to learn about constructing international trade deals, do you know what? I'll listen to someone who's constructed international trade deals successfully. I'm not going to be someone who's going to listen to a load of wealthy elite yahoos who have no experience in international trade or diplomacy and who only pushed us to leave the EU because they were a bit worried that they might have to pay tax sometime soon. We were told, I've already mentioned this, there's a few topics that kept recurring, that we would definitely have a fully fledged trade deal before we left. The people who knew about these things said it was pure fancy and arrogance. We now know it to be true. They also said the reason they said we would definitely have one is because all the captains of industry, all the industrial leaders within the EU member states, France, Italy, Spain, Germany, and so on, would force their politicians to come up with a deal. They thought that we could just take the attitude of we'll just sit back and wait till they come to us because their leaders of industry will not want us to crash out with no deal. They'll be scared shitless of it and they'll force their politicians to give us whatever we want. Not a peep out of them. Not a peep. Because they know, yes, they do not want to lose their trade with the UK. But what's more important is the integrity of the single market. If they have to give up something, they will reluctantly give up the UK. It's less important. And again, the proof of something else that these Brexiteers were saying 2 years ago that has not transpired. We have not had any rumblings of discontent from within continental Europe, from their industries going to complaining to their politicians that they're not doing well enough. There's been none of that at all. The other thing that makes it hugely unpredictable is that no developed nation ever in history has ever left a trade bloc. And as I've already said, the EU is like the most advanced bloc in the world. As such, you can predict certain things. Certain things are going to be known because, just from a legal point of view and from an economic and a legal point of view, you can certainly predict. Political point of view, very difficult because politicians are not always predictable. But it's very difficult to predict exactly how it will go. But of course, what some people do then is they latch onto that and say, oh, well, it could be marvellous then. It could be like paradise. No, we know it's not going to be like that. We know it's going to be devastating because again, he went on to point out that we basically at the moment have a whole generation that has never experienced political upheaval, and it's behaving as a result in a rather cavalier manner. I think it goes back to what I was talking about in the video just before, about the idea that in this country we haven't got that living memory of invasion. And that makes us cavalier about peace. Although we know that there are conflicts around the world and that we sometimes engage with them, we feel safe in our own shores because we don't have the memory, or even people we can talk to that have the memory of invasion. As a result, we take peace for granted. And just in this way, because we haven't had political upheaval for a generation, that generation takes it, and even the generation that might remember it so far in the past, people take it for granted, and they'll say such stupid things as, "Oh, well, it couldn't possibly happen in the modern world," But as he pointed out, people were thinking exactly the same thing after a long period of peace and prosperity, just before 1914 in Europe, and then a little thing happened which blew it all out of proportion. Obviously, we're not going to have World War again. But in terms of the devastating effects on a nation that is walking blind into a fantasy of unicorns and Care Bears because it just doesn't appreciate, it doesn't think that its country is vulnerable. There's too many people in this country who do not think that our systems are vulnerable, that we'll just be able to carry on, and that the worst that can possibly happen is we'll manage much as we are now, but there's the potential for it to be better. And that's what they think. And that is dangerous thinking. And again, it's one of those things. Part of me thinks, do you know what? I'd like to be there when it all goes to shit and I can get to... Because everyone loves saying, I told you so. But the problem is there's the other part of my brain that's going, no, you idiot, because you'll be part of it too. You don't get to watch those people. You'll be with them. Anyway, the attempts to keep people in the dark. So this was a big one I've again talked about recently. The attempts to keep people in the dark about what is basically one of the most complex negotiations in the world was daft and wasted a lot of time. Now, people needed to know what they were getting themselves into. Now, the way I would read this is leaving it late before we really started to find anything out, because we were clueless for a lot of years. Well, a lot of years, a year and a half. I think part of that was because nothing was really happening, but if it was, we certainly weren't kept up to date with it. And I think the reason Theresa May didn't want to let us know anything and to leave it as late as possible before telling us anything was she thought it would increase the chance of getting this deal through. He did talk about May's deal, and he said it's a bad deal. There's no way around it. It's a bad deal. But he also said it was very predictable that this is what the deal would look like, because she was trying to satisfy extremes within her party who had these fantasy ideas, and this was the deal that was going to inevitably ensue. So although it's a bad deal, it's the only deal that was ever going to happen. Whereas if they'd had a more realistic view right from the start, and especially if they hadn't bloody well triggered Article 50 when they did, then actually we would have had a chance. So it's not that Brexit was completely doomed to failure. It is now. But yeah, she obviously felt that it increased the chance of getting it through. But in actual fact, I think what's been shown is it's lowered the chance, because Parliament are not happy. They found the government in contempt because the government were not releasing information in terms of the advice they were receiving about it. Parliament is not pissing about here. It's not going to let something through just because there isn't much time to debate it. It's not their fault there isn't enough time to debate it. So in actual fact, rather than increasing the chance of getting it through, she's reduced the chances. If they'd have been more open and honest earlier on, there'd have been more time to debate it and a higher chance that we'd end up with something, whereas we've ended up with nothing. So it looks. Obviously, the vote hasn't actually taken place yet. Another week, I think, a week or so for that. The other thing is, he talked about the extremes within the debate right now. So you've got two extremes. On the one hand, you've got the people who are going, right, let's go for it, go for no deal, that's ideal for us. They cheerfully jumping off the cliff, whilst continuing to lie about the arrangements in place. Now, I'd done a video about the arrangements that are sort of in place in the event of no deal, and how they're not going to offer comfort to anyone because that's all they are, arrangements. It's a loose, informal arrangement, nothing written down, nothing signed, and therefore they can be retracted by anyone at any time, like that. So they're talking about this, and they're also behaving as if in the event of no deal, because at the moment people aren't really believing that our politicians are going to be crazy enough to allow a no deal. At some point, it's going to, if it happens, I mean, nothing's inevitable yet, but it's almost like everyone, even the people who are not delusional, are in a bit of a daze, you know. And they're behaving as if in the event of a no deal, everyone will snap out of it. And all of a sudden, lots of individual private little arrangements will suddenly come forth. They won't. But then you've got the other extreme of the debate, which is where I would place myself, I guess, where you've got the people who are pushing for a people's vote, which is a term he says he doesn't like, but effectively another referendum. And with Remain on the ballot still. And he said that, you know, the problem with that, of course, is, again, there's another problem. Even though I'm on that side, it's still a problem that I acknowledge, is that I'm not stupid enough to think that if we had another poll, a better poll this time at least where the people who are voting leave say why they're voting leave, so we can at least form, you know, the actual will of the people. But I'm not crazy enough to think that all of a sudden it'd be 80% in favour of Remain. It might be a majority in favour of Remain. Well, I believe it would be a majority in favour of Remain. Hopefully a bigger majority than it was the other way around, but still not necessarily massive. It may even be as low as like 60% Remain. I'd like to think that a lot of the people who didn't go out to vote, because although it was a very good turnout, it wasn't a great turnout. I mean, by our standards it was, but, you know, should have been higher for something so important. Maybe now, at the very least, even if not that many people have changed their mind, maybe more people will at least agree it's important and will get out and vote. And then who knows? But either way, I believe that there would be a large proportion of the population who would still vote to leave, on whatever basis. And having another referendum risks disenfranchising those people. Those people who felt that their voice was heard, but then 2 years later, after some pantomime, it's all been reversed, and they'll feel disenfranchised from the political system, and they'll be thinking, well, what's the point then? And the reason for this, of course, is because, you know, we're told that a referendum, you know, you have a referendum on a thing, we're not going to have another one for at least a generation, and it's not the sort of thing you should keep doing again and again. I mean, there are some countries where they have them. I mean, Switzerland have quite a few referenda. They have them all the time. In this country, we don't really. In fact, you know, there's been more referenda in the last, like, well, 10 years than in the whole of British history. It's mad. But so, yeah, so there is that risk as well. I mean, you know, what we've got literally in this case is we've got a split in the country, and there's no one even attempting to heal the rifts, and there's no one will. And this split could exist for a generation or more. It really could. So, yeah. So, but the other thing is, he didn't say this, but the way I look at it is that, so I agree with those extremes. Those extremes that are very apparent. And you think to yourself, when you talk about extremes, you're usually talking about theoretical outcomes, and you know that the actual outcome is going to be somewhere in the middle. You know, it's fine to talk about extremes, but the extremes are unlikely. Whereas in this particular case, the extremes are actually the thing that looks likely. In fact, it looks almost certain, because what is in the middle? In the middle is May's deal, but that looks likely to be sunk. Which means only one of two things can happen. That means either we will crash out of the EU with no deal, or the brakes will be put on it with another referendum, hastily assembled if there's still time, I don't know. So I can't actually see another outcome. So in actual fact, one of those two extremes is going to be the probable conclusion. But which one? And it's not just May's government as well, which gets his disdain. He also poured scorn on Jeremy Corbyn's idea, because remember, although he says, as I was talking about yesterday, although he says that he's okay pushing for a people's vote, if that's what we want, his preference is for a general election. But, you know, his idea that he can trigger a general election, win it, and still have time to completely renegotiate before we leave is laughable. And even if what he really means is have the general, because we know what he really means. We know he wants us to leave. He thinks that what he can do is we go out the EU, Conservatives get all the blame for the shit we're in. He wins the general election. Then he gets to try and change our, you know, relationship with the EU. But again, he'll be doing all of this without any experience of international trade, negotiations or diplomacy. How is it going to go any better? How is it? You know, especially for someone, because unlike Theresa May, Jeremy Corbyn doesn't want us in the EU. Theresa May does. You know, she just acts like she never actually answered the question, would you now vote against it? We know she was very much in favour of staying in it because she provided very powerful speeches in favour of staying before the referendum. So we know that she thinks we're better off in. Jeremy Corbyn doesn't, on balance. He's not totally opposed to all the systems, but on balance he's not. So that would make him even weaker in negotiations, quite frankly, because he's effectively hostile to the EU. I mean, again, it's all the kitchen nightmares again. We've got all these people who keep saying what they would do, and yet none of them are experienced in the things they say they're going to do. It's kitchen nightmares all over again. Maybe we need to send Gordon Ramsay into Parliament. Maybe he can sort them out. So, yeah, I mean, in conclusion, what I would say, and again, I would recommend that you watch it yourself. I think he goes on for a little bit longer than me. I don't know how long I've been going on for, actually. It might be a while. What I would say is what worried me most throughout all of this, because much of it was, you know, stuff I already sort of knew, is the fact that he kept talking about the need when we have these debates, because these debates must come, that we need to be honest about them. Because he did sort of say that, you know, Theresa May was correct when she called on people in Parliament to be honest with the debate, to actually be honest, which of course was a futile thing to say in Parliament. But even when it comes to the debate after Brexit, it won't, because we don't do honest debates in this country. That's why we're in the mess we're in. I'm not even sure we really do debates properly. We don't really even do debates in this country. So if his suggestion is that we need to wake up and face reality before we can even start to sort out this mess, it's going to be at least months before that happens. It's going to be at least months before people wake up and see what's happening, by which time real people will be suffering, and by which time that's only when we'll be able to start the debate. And debates take a hell of a long time. So I'll leave you with that. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content. Hopefully we're building up towards the 1,000 subscriber mark. When I hit that, I've got a few specials coming out in terms of where I'm actually going to address the leavers, who I know there's plenty of leavers watch my stuff. Thank you very much for your comments. And I'm basically planning some videos on answering some of the dumbest statements made by leavers. Did I say dumbest? I meant most persistent. So until then, I'll see you later.